Funeral home, he's going to talk about a number of things, and one of them are funeral practices and the history of this and so forth. But he is in the business, and this is, we get kind of serious for a while, because in my family, Irene and I have lost a number of family members in the last 2 years. It just happens. And what kind of things do you think about? What should you know about? Practices, details, but quite a number of things. So we're taking a little time tonight to be serious, but to be practical. And we're also seeing if we can do this without the PA system. We know Jason's got a wonderful voice. I've talked to him before. But if you guys in the back or anybody can't hear, let us know, and I think we can do something about it. So this is Jason Badman of the Hartwell Funeral Home.
I'd like to thank all of you for coming out tonight. I hope I can be helpful. The topic tonight, the title is Funerals Past to Present. Now, the first thing I had to ask myself is past. How far back do we want to go here? Back to the cavemen? You know, before written history, you've got to use your imagination a little bit probably, and, you know, look back at archaeology on how people would have buried their dead if they buried their dead. If you went back to the days of the cavemen, you know, would they have even taken the time to bury the dead, you know? And, but we have a great reference that we can start at, the biblical reference of the burial of Christ. Christ's body was wrapped, and perfume was put on the body, and it was placed in a tomb. Days later, the women came to put more perfume on the body. And actually, there are a group of people that still take care of their dead like this today. When a person passes, they will dress the body, they will casket the body, they will put it in a real simple wooden box. They'll take it, they'll have services, and they carry it in on their shoulders. They're carrying it out on their shoulders. And they will put the body in to the side of the grave. They will take the body out of the box. The box just served in order to have the service, to carry the body have the service. They'll place the body in the ground, and then they all cover the body with the dirt. And actually, that's the Muslim faith. They still bury almost like Christ. They really do, even though it's a totally different religion. And they actually, when they put the body in the ground with no casket, they will put planks over top because they said it's symbolic of a tomb. They said in the old country they would take stones and they would place them over the top and build like a cave to put the body in. Now in this area, what was here in this area before Europeans were here? Native Americans. They had a great presence in this area. You go up to Pompey Hill, there's a sharpening stone. It was an outpost for hunting. Up on Indian Hill Road toward Manlius, one of the first masses in Onondaga County ever took place. You go down to Labrador Pond, there was a Bob Fairchild right here. He told me they had found a birch bark canoe in that Labrador Pond. We bury a lot of Native Americans also through our other funeral home on Onondaga Hill. And they used to go to the pond because there would be herbs there that would grow nowhere else but in that Labrador Pond. It's got a similar growing as up in the mountains of the Adirondacks because of the hills. But the Native Americans, to this day, when a person passes, we would go to the house. Most of the time, they try to keep the person in the house. We go to the house, we pick them up, bring them back and to the funeral home, and they would, the Native Americans like to dress their own, and they'll casket, and they like to use a pine box, and then we need to bring the casket back to their house. And they like to have in-home calling hours for 1 or 2 days, kind of like they used to do with the Europeans here. And then the next day, they would have, the next day, everybody gathers at the house, and the faith keepers would say a little prayer, and everybody files past the casket. They take the body to the longhouse. They have services there, men on one side, women on another. Then they all file back out, and then they go to the grave. And then they lower the casket, and they all put dirt in there. And before they leave, they have to put the dirt on the casket. And then they all leave, and then they cover the grave after that. And once the body is in that grave, it's like taboo. You do not bring that body up again. It's got to stay down. But these are just examples of how people's faith plays a great role in how they bury their dead or how they take care of their dead. And it depends on a person's faith on what determines on how they would bury them. Once the early settlers started coming into the area, you can imagine how, when the settlers first came in here, it was a very self-service. When somebody passed, there wasn't the resources here. The same as though if a person's pet passed, what do? You have to take care of it. It's got to be taken care of. When the settlers first arrived into this area, it would have been a very self-service type of era. Now, once things became a little bit more established and the towns started popping up, the writer in the late 1700s, the different towns in the area started popping up. Undertaking establishments started following in order to help the families get through this, and in order to help meet their needs on what they would need. Furniture stores would sell coffins. Before that, they would have to build them. Somebody in the self-service type era would have to build the coffin. And then undertaking establishments started coming out, and they could help families in this process. Furniture, I have an example here I'm going to pass around. This is a very early undertaking establishment. 1874, William Earl. They claim this is Tully's first undertaker. And they actually have a picture here of a horse-drawn hearse. And they're out in front of a building that sits now where the parking lot is at the Pizza and More over here in Tully. This sat next to the Slayton building. And it was an undertaking establishment that was up on the second story, and there was a furniture store down below. And I'm going to pass that around. You can see that. Right here in Fabius, in the 1800s, William Estes and his son-in-law, Newton Benedict, ran an undertaking business and furniture store out of where the law office is next to Anna's Country Store. The hearse was horse-drawn in those days, and in wintertime, bobsleds were used. Bob Fairchild had mentioned to me that he had noted white horses. They used to have white horses. And I have a picture, not of that establishment, but of a sleigh-drawn hearse. And this is just, these are actually pictures that I pulled off of eBay. People are selling photographs, old vintage photographs. And I found that on eBay. This is another photograph of an early undertaking establishment. These could have been furniture stores. These could have been barber shops originally. They could have been livery services, because the livery had the horses that could pull the hearse. And this is just like, it looks like a picture out of the Wild West. And it's just a real, you know, it was, the family had a much greater responsibility in these days for choices that they wanted to make. And the undertakers were there to help them along. This is a picture out of later on in front of a church with a horse-drawn hearse. Now, originally, a main factor to keep in mind is when these undertaking establishments first came about, they were supplying, they could have been supplying gravestones made out of slate or marble. They could have been supplying the hearse. They could have been supplying coffins or caskets. Originally, before the process of embalming, they used to have caskets with little viewing windows in there, because they recognized the fact that people, when they expire, they can spoil. And they actually had caskets with ice that you could pack in there. There was all different ways that they would try to keep the person from spoiling, until a time around the Civil War. During the Civil War, the process of embalming became into the mainstream following the assassination death of Abraham Lincoln. Up to that point, it existed, but it wasn't mainstream whatsoever. Embalming had actually been started by the ancient Egyptians, but until the time around the Civil War, people didn't want to go there. They wanted other things. And what would happen is the Civil War veterans would pass. They were away from home. On the battlefield, they would embalm people, and they would send them back on the train. And because after the Civil War, people saw this happening, and they started asking the local undertaking establishments, hey, can you provide embalming for my family member? I want to wait a few days till so-and-so gets back from wherever they might have traveled to hold the mass, to hold the services. And it was discovered that the practice of embalming people could delay services, and it wouldn't have to be so immediate, and people would have more time to pay their final respects. And what would happen is some of the existing undertakers would say, okay, I can learn this. I'm going to try this. I'm going to see if I can learn this from a qualified person, another undertaker maybe. And that's what would happen at first. But some of the undertakers are like, okay, no. It's time for me to get out of this business. And they might have been in the furniture store, but it's time to sell out. I'm not doing that. They might have been in the livery service. Okay, it's time for me to get out of this. Too many people are asking for this process. And the ones that did perform embalming, perhaps the undertaking establishment, like I had showed you in the one photo, was up out of a second story. Well, the original undertaking establishments were often in just small little places. Like I had mentioned the law office over here, they're just little buildings, and they didn't need much because they supplied more goods than, they supplied the goods and the knowledge, but they didn't supply a gathering place. At this point, they were supplying different items for funerals. But when the embalming started coming into the picture, they would often perform the embalming right within a person's house. The family would contact the undertaker, and they would come right in the house, and they would perform this oftentimes on furniture, on the bed itself, and later on, the undertaker would actually bring in like a board, and they called them cooling boards, and they would perform the embalming right within people's houses. And I have an example of some early equipment. This is actually a Dodge Chemical embalming bottle. They would mix embalming fluid in this. This would hang upside down, and gravity would put the embalming fluid into the decedent. Now, once the person was embalmed, they would be dressed, and they would often hold calling hours right within the family's home. And this is also a time in which now the folks that were practicing as undertakers, they had a much larger financial commitment to the business, because now they had to start supplying a lot more of equipment. It wasn't just selling goods as part of a funeral. They actually had all different equipment they would bring right inside the house. This is a point in time in which the wake was now being held inside the family home. Calling hours were being held within a family home. And they would bring in equipment such as this, and they would bring it on the back of their wagons, and they're in leather-bound boxes. They had all sorts of equipment in leather-bound boxes, and they would bring it right inside the family home. And we're talking, the coffin would be here, they would have the big drapes behind the casket, the candles, the crucifix, the trays. People would come right to the house, similar to what the Native Americans do today. When we set up a funeral for a Native American, preferably they like to have the calling hours right within the family home. We bring in all the equipment right to the family home. Friends come right to the family home. They park in your front yard. They're walking through your house. If your house is small, that poses a problem. And this went on for a great many years. The undertakers would come and bring everything right in, and then after the calling hours, they could go and proceed with the hearse to the church, if that's what the family had chose, and then to the cemetery, and that continued. And I'm going to show you a couple pieces here. Now, these covers are much newer than the equipment is. These boxes are old. But they would come right within the house, and they would set up. You would want to start. You'd want to start with your church truck, because this would hold, and you got to forgive me because this is really old. And I'll give you a little quick history. In Tully, William Earl ran an undertaking business out of the second-story building that once sat in front of Pizza and More in Tully. He was a Civil War veteran and is buried in the Tully Cemetery. Is that correct, Bob? And he has claim to Tully's first undertaker, the photo I passed around. In Tully, following William Earl, the Baldwin Funeral Home opened up. And that sits right where the doctor's office is in Tully. That was the funeral home, the Baldwin Funeral Home. And it was there for a good many years until 1945, when John Hartwell bought the business from Mr. Baldwin and moved it over onto 11 Clinton Street. And in 1994, my father, John Badman, bought the business, and we ran it at the 11 Clinton Street address for quite some years until about 2 years ago we moved over on 281 in Tully, and that's where we're at now, over by the Dollar General in Tully. So this equipment dates back into the Baldwin days. This is late 1800s, early 1900s. A lot of the equipment, but this is the equipment that they would use to set up at the house before the days of calling hours in a funeral home. This is when they were still called undertakers. And this is a church truck, and they would bring this in, and the casket would go on top of that. And like I said, these would have been in boxes. And this would be on the side. And these are the candles. And they're made out of mahogany. And the undertakers would go right in, and they would set this right up inside the family's home. And as you can imagine, if you were going to have a wake in your home, a lot of work would really go into that. This would have been a mass card tray. Crucifix. And obviously this would be for a Catholic service. And let's see here. And you're going to love the color of this. I think it's like metallic pink. And this would have all arrived along with the funeral director. And there's your kneeler. And as you can see, it would have been quite an endeavor trying to set everything up. The early undertakers would embalm in the family home, dress in the family home, shave the person in the family home. Everything would be done right in the family home. Until some undertakers started saying, why don't you use my home to hold the wake? And that's when the idea of funeral home really came about. That's what made the distinction between undertakers and funeral home. Because now this is a home for funerals. And you don't have to come into my home and set all this up and have people parking all over in the yard, and even if it was horses, you'd have to have place for everybody to come and set everything would be set up right at the house. And there'd also be drapes that went in the back, and the flowers would be put up, and a side note, the flowers, now when you think funeral directors, undertakers, a lot of times you're always wearing black. The early Christians were the first to ever have flowers included in a wake, because with being a Christian, you believe in the resurrection, you believe in life after death, and flowers are happiness, and they were a sign of new life. And that's when flowers first got introduced into funerals. Before that, it was very dark and very, grim. And if you ever seen some of these gravestones, like say in Philadelphia and New York, there's some crazy little sayings written on them. They got a lot of superstition associated with them. Even if you go over to Delphi Falls, behind the little Methodist church over there, they have a cemetery, which many churches had cemeteries right behind the church, and they have a little stone wall all around it, and they had stairs that went over the fence, over the stone wall, because people, they had a lot of superstition there, and they thought that the ghosts, like the spirits, needed to stay in. And a lot of that took place back in the early days. Until now, we've progressed from the funeral inside the family home, and now funeral homes started popping up, from undertakers to funerals within the funeral director's establishment. And this is when things really started turning much more modern, and more of what we think of as the funeral home nowadays. Now, along with the embalming, in New York State, in 1899, that's the first year they required there to be a license for an undertaker. There was an embalmer's license, and there was an undertaker's license. And that's when, that's another point, just like after the Civil War, when people started embalming, undertakers started embalming, and a lot of people got out of the business. They were like, this isn't for me. This is another point at which, people had to make, the undertakers of the time had to make a decision. Now they're requiring licensing. People are asking to have the service in my place and not their place. And some of them, like you saw in the pictures, they were only like little shacks. They were just little spaces. They didn't have place for a funeral inside of them. So that was another point in which they had to make decisions. Hey, if we're going to go forward and do we want to pursue this, Okay. Another note here I have is when the railroad came through. The railroad really changed everything, because with the railroad, they, just like the Erie Canal, they could get in things that people were asking for, that they would like. People that did have money to purchase these different items, the railroad really did help undertakers, and then at the time, that really did help them bring in different items that people were asking for. The drapes that would have been behind this setup here, They used to be referred to by other undertakers as a jack-in-the-box because they're really small and they open right up. Yeah. Now, again, with America being the melting pot, obviously this is a Catholic setup, but there's all different religions, and people coming to this country, they had all different practices, and from the old country, they may have had all different practices, and again, the railroad would have helped them bring in some of these items that they might have used in funeral ceremonies back in the old country. Another innovation that had come is when we went from the horse-drawn hearse to the automobile. That was just another decision that the undertakers had to make. Do I want to go this route? Do I want to put more investment into this? But what really grabbed hold was when the funerals were held in the home. The funeral establishment had to be big enough to accommodate the folks coming into the calling hours. Things at this point, people started, you'd be able to compare funeral home to funeral home by, per se, what kind of parking they had, how big their room was, more modern things that you would look for today. You know, what you would compare each one to. And with the funeral home, brought the preparation room for the decedent. They had the funeral home could have their own preparation room, and they wouldn't need to continue to embalm people in the family home. And that was just another positive for the consumers, for the people at the time. Many would not want that to be taken care of, but the time that it was being performed in the homes, that was kind of the norm. But when they started having in funeral home calling hours, and then they also would have, they could have the preparation room in the funeral home, and things really started to progress there. Now at this point, I wanted to ask some of you folks if you wanted to maybe share. I know sometimes it's hard, but do you remember any of your first experiences with a funeral home? Going to maybe a wake, or how it was, you know what I mean? I think we can learn a lot from what you guys have to share as far as what your first experiences would be. Does anybody want to mention anything like that?
I just soon say.
Yep.
Remember, I was 7 years old when my grandfather died, and I was always with him. And one of the Baldwin, Liam Baldwin, was the funeral director, and he had his services and everything right there. I was scared to go into where he was, because he was in the parlor that they never used only for funerals, you know. I remember all the mother and father and all, they couldn't get me to go in there. I was going to have a tantrum, I guess. So Liam come out, he took hold of my hand, he talked to me, walked me in, and so I could go right up, and he told me to put my hand right up on my grandfather and touch it. And from that day on, it never bothered me since. You know, it was an experience, you know, that because I'd always been with my grandfather, and it's kind of, and then see him just laying there, it kind of freaked me out, I guess you'd say. So, but that was,
Sure.
and after that, it never bothered me after that. lot of kids, you know, people, they get kind of scared to say where they're gone. They don't try to explain it to them. And some of the younger generation now, you can tell that because they're more interested in just socializing with other people, especially if they come to a calling hours or something. They don't seem to have the respect like we used to when we were a lot younger.
Anybody else that wants to? I stop at this point because this brings us to a time period that, you know, an experience like this would have happened. Yeah. So I didn't know if anybody else.
There's a difference from when I first went to funerals. Excuse me. As of today,
Sure.
and it means that I'm more related to the Bible and
Yeah.
understand it more.
Yeah.
Because it used to be all sobbing and crying and
Sure.
all this.
Yeah.
And now it's celebration of their life.
Yes. Yeah.
So there is quite a bit of difference in the way I feel.
That's right.
About a funeral, you know, and like I've heard a lot of people say, well, the person didn't even cry, you know,
Yeah.
and it isn't like you're not crying inside, but
Sure.
you're just happy to have that kind of life with the person.
Mhm.
So there is a difference, I think, in
Yeah.
today. The way
Absolutely. Yep. And religion plays the dominant role here. Religion has always guided funerals. It's a person's beliefs is what really guides the way they bury their dead, or now they cremate. And in the past, before say the 1960s, you hardly ever heard of cremation. And now it's right in the mainstream. But it was, at one time it was looked down upon, and now, things change. And now, it's your own personal beliefs. Whatever you believe is, that a lot of times that's how it determines what you choose for what happens when you pass on. Yeah, what you want for services. Yeah, but whatever the services that you'd like, that's what the undertaker has always had a role of, trying to help facilitate what, the customer's needs are. Yep, and it continues today. In the days of old, they had calling hours at the funeral home. They'd have calling hours 2 days, 2 to 4, 7 to 9, 2 days, And now they might have 1 day, 4 to 7, 6 to 8, whatever time's convenient. And a lot of times they don't even have any calling hours. It totally depends on what the families would like to choose. And like I had mentioned in the past, it was largely guided by the traditions in the individual churches that the people attended, and what was customary with them. But nowadays, we're in a society that is much less religious than we were before, and it's not always the same guidelines that they once had. And at this point, with the remains, you don't always need to bury. They cremate, and they'll scatter the ashes at sea. They'll scatter ashes on the golf course. There's all different options. And it's not just a setup like this that you would be looking at anymore. Nowadays, there's many more options, and it's wide open. So,
Yeah.
Yes.
Let me add something about
Yep.
calling hours.
okay, yeah,
I think, since you said this so well, as you made a bigger establishment, as you made a place to have calling hours, as you made a place where crowds could come in, it just added so many things to the experience. Let me tell you something, it's almost a joke-like, but when I was about 7, the school principal died, and they had the calling hours in a school gymnasium. And I remember attending with my parents, and I looked at this man, and I can't think of his name right now. I looked at him, and I guess I was a joker, and I said, I don't think Mr. So-and-so is going to get over this. But later, when my mother died, they had a very long calling hours, 4 or 5 hours, and I thought that's too much. But when I went there, and all of these people who had known my parents for so many years, decades, they came in, they talked to me, they told me stories, and it was a wonderful, wonderful experience.
What is this, they're kind of going, it seems to me then anyway, they're burying people out of churches at the calling hours at.
They do, we definitely do that. We still will set people up at the home, we'll set people up at the church. There's just so many more options that there used to be, than there used to be. We'll do all different options that we do, and it's really just up to the families how much or how little that they would like. Now there is one thing that does remain the same. There's some paperwork here. No matter what a person chooses, some of you may have seen this. This is a copy of the death certificate. Everybody, when they pass, this ends up getting filled out. And sometimes family members don't always know the information that needs to be included on this certificate. And this is something that if you felt it, that you would like, you could fill this out for yourself and give it to your family member. And they could put this in a safe place. This is part of what funeral directors need nowadays in order to gather if you're going to be cremated, if you're going to be buried, no matter what disposition is going to happen. If you're going to be entombed, any of that. This is a document that we use and we file with the Bureau of Vital Statistics. And here in Onondaga County, it's at the basement of the Civic Center. And the doctor has up to 72 hours to sign this, and we have up to 72 hours to file this. So that can sometimes be a problem, because we have the same amount of time. So if they don't want to sign it at the last minute, it ends up getting late. But they understand that down at Vital Records. So this is some information. I'm going to put these out here, and if you want to pass them down, and you can hang on to those and keep one for yourself.
My husband just passed, and the undertaker made many members pay for it.
Mhm.
Many times.
Yes.
So each
And
of the children
each-
have one.
Each copy in Onondaga County it's $30 for the first one and $15 for each additional copy every time you order them. So what they're trying to do is they want you to order them all at the same time. And in Cortland County, they're only $10. So if you pass in Cortland County, they're $10. Yeah. But this is the vital statistical information that we gather.
Is that an option that you give to the family members or whoever?
What's that?
Is that
The
paper?
form?
Yeah.
Normally, when somebody passes, I fill this out with them.
And then you tell them that they can have a copy of it.
Well, this is actually one, this is what they look like.
Right, no.
They're still carbon.
Oh,
Yep. And until it's signed by a doctor, it means nothing. It needs to have the certification, and it needs to have a seal on it. It's got a raised seal on a real one. And these are just copies, they're just blanks. You could probably pick it right up offline. It wouldn't, you can get them pretty easily. But this is the information that holds up people a lot of times when they're making arrangements for a loved one. They might not always know on here.
Jason, are you going to talk about prices?
I
I
can
just-
talk about whatever you want to talk about.
Okay, I do, because I'm just curious, if a funeral was held in the home and you brought equipment in
Yep.
the 1800s or early 1900s or right up until whenever,
Sure.
what would that price be as opposed to me coming to your home or a church?
Okay, for our funeral home in particular, let me grab, I have a general price list.
Because if it's
Okay.
cheaper to be in the home, we all
If-
want to do that.
If you set up in the home, what happens here? You want to pass these out to you? You want these guys? These are general price lists. Before any funeral director talks about prices, you guys have to have a copy of this. That's part of the Federal Trade Commission for all funeral homes. They have to hand out a general price list for their particular funeral home. So if you want one of these, you can grab it. Or if you don't want one, you can send them down.
The federal form there, then the federal government is shut down, so forget about it right now.
There's not enough here. I don't know if there's enough. There's some more. Yep. Okay, as far as prices, what that would be is that would be called set up at the, let me find it here. Transfer and set up for a funeral service at a location other than the funeral home. On our price list, it's $300. So if it was the church or if it was your own home, it wouldn't make a difference. What does make a difference is if you wanted supervision for the calling hours, there's a charge for that. If you're at the church, depending on the clergy, you may need supervision for the calling hours. At your home, you wouldn't need anybody, because it's your home. So you can do whatever you want there. Yeah.
All right, so, but that does not include the embalming.
No, those are all separate items. They're all listed out in here.
Yeah, okay.
See, now each individual, like, if anybody came up to me and said, okay, this is what I would want, you can itemize it all out. But there's not just a giant round figure that you can pull out of the air. Actually, bundling in New York State is illegal. You cannot just put funerals, $2,000, and includes everything. It has to be broken up. And in the price list, you can see every item is broken up. Now, there is one exception to that rule. That would be alternative services. And you have a section on here, direct cremation, and you have a section on here, direct burial. And those items can be bundled. And it does list, it's right toward the first part of the booklet, and it does list what that includes. Yeah.
These prices just for your place?
That's for our place. Yep. Yep. Every funeral home controls their own prices. They could be 4 times that much down the street. I have no idea. Yep. And some places are. Yeah.
So, when I was young, I don't remember going to any funeral home
Yeah.
other than somebody's parlor.
Yeah.
And a lot of times you didn't know they passed away, you went by the house.
It would be in the house.
Yeah.
In the house. Yeah. Okay.
And there would be a crepe on the door.
Yes. They still do that on the reservation.
And then you could buy and think,
Yeah.
oh, somebody passed
They-
away there, otherwise
yeah.
you might not have known that.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Does the body have to be embalmed?
Absolutely not. Yep. It is not required by any law. You do not need it involved.
Right?
What's that?
Jewish religion, they do not embalm.
Well, there's no law in New York State that says a body has to be involved. But it can be a funeral home requirement, depending on the funeral home, to embalm a body if you want the casket open at calling hours. You can't, like at our funeral home, you can't have the casket open at calling hours without the body being embalmed, because it wouldn't really be viewable. after a person passes, things happen. And you wouldn't want open casket with no embalming, because what would happen is people would come in and they'd say, geez, that guy did a horrible job. And you can't just tell everybody, oh, that one's not embalmed, it's not my fault. So that's why, the funeral home may require embalming if the casket's open. If it's closed, there's things that we can do in order, as long as it doesn't drag on for weeks, without embalming.
Do you need a cement coffin with the
A
casket?
cement, no, what that's called a vault.
Oh,
There's a book here, and I'll show a picture of what that is. This is a concrete box. Actually, the most basic one is right here. This is the most basic vault that we sell. This is a concrete chest, they call it, and the casket is lowered into this. And the reason that this is required by many cemeteries, there's no law in New York State that says you have to buy a vault. But many cemeteries require them, because without a vault, over time, where the casket was buried will sink. And back in the olden days, they would dig graves by hand. But nowadays, they have heavy equipment. And in order to get the heavy equipment to another grave, say this grave was by the road, but they have to go 5 rows down or something. They have to drive that heavy equipment over there. So many cemeteries nowadays require this, because they don't want the graves to all sink while they're driving the equipment over it. But there is no rule that says you have to have one of these. Actually, Valley Cemetery has places that do not require one, and Oakwood has places that don't require one. But don't let that fool you, because they could just mark up their grave opening. You still got to look into how much is the grave opening. Because when you go to a cemetery, you're buying a cemetery plot, but when the time comes, you also have to pay for them to open the grave. And opening the grave isn't just the price of digging the hole. A lot of people think, oh, that's just the price of digging the hole. Why is it so much? And that's not the whole truth. Even though it's called a grave opening, it's also mowing the grass from now till they run out of gasoline, I guess. So you got the perpetual care in there. Back in the day, you had to pay extra for perpetual care. Now, all the perpetual care, every time you go to a cemetery that's, a regular operating cemetery, they all come with perpetual care. You don't pay extra for it. No.
Jason, are
Yes.
there rules and regulations in the state of New York for dispersing of,
Ashes?
correct?
If it's on your own private property, you can do whatever you want. If it's on a golf course, you better ask the guy that owns the golf course if it's privately owned. If you're on public lands, you better not get caught, because you're going to probably get in trouble. So there are rules with that, but it depends on what specific place you're talking here. And a big one, some people, they'll cremate a person, they'll get the remains back, and then there's a family cemetery plot. But they don't want to pay the grave opening. So they go there at night, they go home, and bury them themselves. Guess how they're going to catch you? When you try to put a gravestone on that grave, they're going to say, there's nobody there named that. And they'll say, oh, then the truth comes out. Then you got to pay your grave opening. Because like I said, it's not just digging the hole, it's mowing the grass, taking care of the cemetery forever. So.
But monuments are put up before the person dies.
No.
Yes, they are.
Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. It depends. Many times they're put afterwards.
My family, I come from a family of monument dealers.
Okay?
So if you put up a monument before you die, how are they gonna know? If you went there and dug it
Well,
up?
we don't want to give too many people ideas here. I'm I'm sure there's always ways to get around it. But normally, even if it's ashes, if you're going to bring them to the cemetery, you need to talk to the person in charge, the sexton in charge of the cemetery, and say, I'd like to arrange for the burial. Now, that brings up another point. Once I take care of the death certificate, and once I file all the paperwork, and the cremation takes place, and the ashes are returned to you, you are free to do with what you please with those ashes as long as it's legal. The cremation is the final disposition of a person. Now, if it's the body, I would be in charge until the body gets lowered into that grave. And then at that point, the cemetery takes, and the vault company would put the lid on, or the cemetery would just fill in the grave at that point. Yep.
I have a question about, is there a general policy among funeral homes about what you do when you take a body for embalming and processing and they are wearing jewelry? What do you do with the jewelry? Do you leave it
Okay.
on them unless they...
If a person has jewelry, the first thing you want to do is ask the family. There's no set rule amongst funeral homes whatsoever, unless it's like a corporate owned, or just, there's a group of funeral homes. But if you're an independent funeral home, it would be up to the funeral home to make up their own rules. Now, at our funeral home, if they had jewelry, and we had, say the person passed away in the house, and we'd be like, well, do you want to keep the jewelry? And then at that point, we would give them opportunity, we can help you take it off if the ring's stuck, or, that sort of thing. But, it's totally, we would ask you for your guidance on what you would like us to do.
We had this is something other people might be aware of, we had a very disturbing encounter with a funeral home in Florida. My aunt died.
Yep.
Suddenly, she was days before somebody found her. My sister and I flew down. She had no children or anything.
Yeah.
We arranged with funeral home to send her back to Illinois where she wanted to be buried.
Mhm.
And then a nephew stuck his nose in and decided we needed a fancier casket, we needed
Oh,
viewing
wow.
hours, we needed an open casket. It was
Sure.
this woman who had been dead for days and 90 degrees.
Yeah.
And we said, no, we can't do it. And so we arranged then to have her cremated. And we were sitting at the funeral home waiting to see whether she could be cremated in the travel casket she was in, or if we needed a special
As long as
cremation
that-
casket. And I asked them, I said, was she wearing any jewelry? And they said, oh yes, she had a watch and a ring. And I said, well, where are they? Well, they're on her. And I said, well, could we have them please? And within like 2 minutes, they were back with a watch and a diamond ring in a velvet bag that I know would have taken them more than 2 minutes to get off. I never figured out, they were so nice, I
Well,
never figured out.
If
it
a
was
person's going to be cremated and they have jewelry, and even if the family wants the jewelry to stay with the person, we would take that jewelry off, have the cremation done, and then put that jewelry in the urn or in the container. Because there's no reason to leave it on. You'll just cause air pollution, first of all, and there'll be nothing left of it. It'll just be
I
disintegrated.
got an urn to put
Yeah.
her ashes in here, and I told the funeral director, who I got that urn from, this story, I said, please, give me a reasonable explanation for this, because they were so nice.
Yeah.
And he said, I can't.
Mm.
He said, I just,
Mm.
he said, even if the person has a plastic ring on,
Yeah.
we'll offer it to the family.
Sure, yeah. No, if there's anything at all, and, we always ask folks, is there anything here, And like, even when they pass at home and the family brings in other clothes for them to wear, we'll offer the clothes they were wearing back if they want it. Anything that was on them, we'll offer it back to the family. Yeah.
Is everything burned?
What's that?
Is everything that's on the body?
With cremation?
Yeah, like
If-
shoes and...
Well, with cremation, whatever the family requests, we'll help them with that. Yeah, like if they wanted the person fully dressed and have, like, say they had, with cremation, you could do all this. You could have calling hours. There's actually caskets that are rental caskets, and they have an insert in them. The lining, the pillows, all the linens, they are part of the cremation container that sits in the casket. So there's all different options. If you wanted the person fully, whatever outfit they were in, that's what they would go to the crematory in. The only thing that can't go in there is like a lot of metal and stuff. Yeah, the metal. You know? But if you wanted them in their regular clothes, I mean, you could leave a ring on, but it would just, there'd be nothing left. The gold melts so quickly.
If you have
Yeah.
metal in your body, like,
They take a magnet over you.
what?
Afterwards, after the cremation's done, they run a magnet through it. Yeah,
Really?
yeah, that's what they do at the crematory. Yeah. When a person goes to crematory, they use natural gas. That's how people are cremated. The minimum, we use the Oakwood Crematory in Syracuse. The minimum, you have to have the person, like in California, they'll take a body bag and they can put people in a body bag and just put them in the crematory. But in this area, they need to be at least in a cardboard container. And then that's put into the retort, it's called. And that's run on natural gas. And it takes a couple hours, and then it doesn't bring a person all the way down to dust. A misconception is a lot of people think it's just all powder, but they actually bring it down to a lot of the large bones. At that point, when the cremation is happening, this isn't my part of it, by the way. The crematory in New York, a funeral home cannot own a crematory unless they were grandfathered in. So we use the Oakwood Crematory on Comstock Avenue up by Syracuse University, and they do lots of cremations up there. But the box will be put in, the cremation, I don't want to get anybody sick here. They fire up the retort. It has bricks in it, like an oven. They warm up, and the person is cremated. It's burned. And then there's still bones. They have a rake. They rake it around, and they'll burn it more. And then what's left, they have like a metal tray. And they have to run a magnet over that. Because the next thing they do is they run it through a pulverizer, which looks like a giant coffee grinder. And they pulverize the remaining bones. Because there's bones that just will not burn up. They have too much calcium in them. And then they take a funnel, and they'll put the funnel, they have the funnel here, and then they'll take a little plastic bag, and they put the cremains in there, and they go down through the funnel into the plastic bag. They take the plastic bag, put it in a plastic box, and then they tie that up, and they have a little tag on there the whole time. When the person comes in, there's a tag with a number on it, like a VIN number on a car. It's got a little number on there, the number of the cremation. And that tag stays with the person before cremation and after cremation, and it's in that box. Even when we get them back, that little tag number's in there still. There's a little metal tag on there. Yep.
And that's a misconception, man. A lot of people tell me you don't get to say that your own ashes back.
No, in New York State, you have to, or you'd be arrested. Yeah, but if you went to a pet cemetery, that would be true. Many pet cemeteries, it's a mass cremation. It's not individual cremation.
You can pay extra.
You can pay extra to get an individual. Yeah, yeah.
The same funeral home in Florida mailed my aunt's ashes to me in a plastic bag in a cardboard box. And I thought,
Yep.
what if that's split open? She could
Yep.
have spread all over the
Up here, it's a plastic bag with a tag on it, with a zip tie, in a plastic box, in a cardboard box.
It's a plastic
That's
bag
how they
in a
are.
cardboard box with regular packaging.
Wow. See, this has a plastic box, and it's a temporary container. Yeah. I might,
Approximately how long does it take?
it's 2 to 3 hours. Yep. But, you know, that's, like I said, that's a choice. If people want to go that route, cremation is there for them. There's also a common misconception that people have is they say, well, cremation's cheaper than burial. That can be true, it might not be true. It depends on what you want with the cremation. Like I said, people could rent caskets, people could have masses, they could have calling hours, they could do everything they do, except when they get to the point that they're going to go to the cemetery, they don't do that part. They go to the crematory. And then they have to wait a few days, and then they can go to the cemetery, because we've got to get the cremains back. So,
Many people want to be buried, I hear them say they want to be buried with their children.
lots of people do.
Are they?
Yes. Yep. That's
I always-
however they want. Nowadays, they put the grandkids will color pictures. They'll put them in a casket. They'll put photographs in there. They'll put. I've seen beer. I've seen whiskey. I've seen cigarettes. I've seen cigars. I've seen their pets, their cremated pets, ashes. Lots of different things they put in the casket that they want to put in there and include that. And there's no problem with that. Yep. All those things are good.
The funeral director makes sure they're buried back to where it is.
The funeral director, we make sure that they're buried with that. We would never do such a thing. Yeah.
One more comment.
Yeah.
I have a plate in my ankle that's not magnetic, so what would happen to that?
They would pick it out.
It wouldn't burn.
They couldn't run it through the grinder.
Right.
It wouldn't burn, and they couldn't run it through the grinder. If they did, it would wreck the grinder. It's they call it a pulverizer, but like I said, it looks like a big coffee grinder. It's stainless steel.
It's not magnetic, so they would have to do that.
They would have, well, there's not a lot of bone. The tray that holds the rest of you is only about this big. And cremains, a lot of people are surprised that they weigh as much as they do, but there's really not that much. Yeah, yeah. And nowadays, people, they don't always just want an urn and put the ashes in there. Sometimes they're spreading the ashes, they take them up to their camp. Sometimes they want every single grandchild to have some. So then we have to divvy them out into little urns. But not everybody does that, you know, but people do just about everything you can imagine nowadays, you know. It's always been whatever the family wants. You know, we'll try to help you, whatever you want done, you know, we can try to help you through that as long as everything's on the up and up, you know, we go right along, yeah.
What's the general price of the urns? They must vary.
Oh, there's very inexpensive urns, and there could be really, I mean, you could buy an urn out of solid gold if you wanted to. You know, there's no upper limit whatsoever. You could have somebody make something with rubies in it if you wanted to, but very inexpensive urns, they could be $100, you know. So, you know, I have, let's see here. I mean, there's simple urns like this they're marbleized urns, and they look like they're marble, but they're actually made out of like a composite, and the ashes are put in through the bottom. And most cemeteries would be okay with you burying this right into the ground. A lot of the Catholic cemeteries now require a vault to put this in. One of those concrete boxes, or it could be a plastic container to put the urn in, because they want to keep track of where everybody is. There's all different kinds of urns, and these are the little keepsake ones that I was telling you about that people like to divvy out. And I have to go in there with a spoon, really. That's what you do. You get a spoon and a little Ziploc bag, and you got to fit them in here. And that's what I do. I put a little twist tie on there, and you put them right in there. Yeah. But it's totally up to the family, and a regular size urn holds about 200 cubic inches. That's what it would have to be to hold an adult. But like you see, there's all sorts of different urns, and this is just an example of an urn vault. The urn goes inside this box. And then it does the same thing as a vault would for a casket. It keeps the grave from sinking. Now, just so you have some more information and you're able to make the best decisions, I'll explain some of caskets. Caskets are divided out into the materials in which they are made. That's what affects the price of caskets. When you have caskets that cost an arm and a leg, they're probably made out of something more valuable, or your undertaker's ripping you off and marking up something that's cheap, and you know what I mean? And just marking up something inexpensive. Questions that you could ask, or different observations here. It's divided into what materials they're made out of. I'm going to read the titles off because probably none of you can see this far away. Caskets, I mean, like I said, you could have a gold casket if you wanted to. But there's bronze, there's copper, there's hardwood caskets, there's stainless steel caskets, there's 16 gauge caskets, which is the thickest that they come. The smaller the number, the thicker the steel. So they're divided out into 16 gauge is thicker, 18 gauge is in the middle, and 20 gauge is the thinner metal. And now caskets, the metal caskets can be further divided into a sealed casket or a non-sealed casket. A sealed casket has a gasket around the rim, and when they're closed, you actually have a little tool that you have to crank them down and close them, and they have a seal on them. They're supposed to make them water resistant. And there's also, now when you get into wood caskets are divided out into what species of wood. So if you wanted, like, the first question I would ask families is, would you prefer a metal casket or a wood casket? And then that's, like I had mentioned, metal caskets are divided into what they're made out of, how thick of steel they are. Stainless, bronze, sealed or unsealed. Now wood caskets, this one happens to be made out of mahogany. So what do you think a mahogany casket is going to cost? Lots of money. And then you have mahogany caskets, and you have, I mean, there's oak, and there's any kind of wood, you know, pine and oak and cedar. They even have cedar caskets. I've seen them. Schuylkill Haven has a cedar casket, which not too many casket companies, I've never seen a cedar casket, but Schuylkill Haven sells a casket made out of cedar. And like your hope chests would be made out of cedar because the moths don't like the cedar. So that's kind of a little interesting one. But the wood caskets are all divided out into what they're made out of, and the features that they have. Now, a big division in wood caskets or metal caskets is also the interior. There's a crepe interior, which is kind of like a satiny silk interior, or there's a velvet interior. You know, and the velvets come in different colors, and there's all different choices, you know. And there's also different panels that you can put in the back. Some people put deer up here, and that's one of the big things nowadays is all the personalization. They have different corners. They put all different corners on the caskets. All different things they get into. They put little panels in the back. Yep, it's all.
You haven't mentioned plywood yet.
How about that?
You got one.
We would call this a fuzzy mahogany.
Yeah.
The fuzzy mahogany, this is a fiberboard casket and cloth, which is basically cardboard, thick cardboard. Yep. So there's inexpensive ones too. How much is that? Let me see. I think it's in another book. Here we go. $7.95. $795. But there's all different ones. Actually, I'm going to show you one. species of wood that people often overlook is a poplar. People all know the cherry and the oak and the walnut and the mahogany, but a poplar casket is the softest of the hardwoods, but it will take a stain and they can make it look like other species of wood without having the cost of the different species of wood. So a lot of people these days, they're buying poplar caskets. And they also have caskets that have laminated sides on them, so that you only have you have a thin lamination of the real wood, but then they're particle board underneath. And a lot of the caskets, the more inexpensive ones, are particle board underneath the bottoms of them, because nobody's going to see that. So,
Hey, just,
yes.
my name's Eric Hansen.
Okay.
Hey, just as kind of a side note here, earlier
Okay.
we were talking about grave opening fees.
Yes.
And how that would last forever to take care of the graveyard.
Yes.
Well, I was thinking they do things a little bit differently in Europe. And when I was stationed in Germany over there, we went to Freiburg to do some research on my wife's genealogy. On her
Sure.
side. So we went to the big graveyard or cemetery in Freiburg, and we're looking around trying to find her ancestors.
Sure.
And I'm noticing something's odd here, because nothing seems to be older than 1910, 1900.
Yep.
And I found this German couple, and between my broken German and their broken English, we found out you rent your plot over
Yep.
there. You don't have it forever, you
Yep.
just rent it, and what
Yep.
happened was during the emigration of all the Germans to the States, the parents forgot to tell their kids, hey, don't forget about grandma and grandpa back in the old country.
Yeah.
They actually removed them.
Yep.
And I said, well, that would explain then why I see these holes are 2 feet by 2 feet.
Yeah.
Because you bury feet first, and you save a bunch of money on,
Oh, I got you.
yeah.
So what do they
I
do
thought
when you don't pay over
We
there?
spent hours in that cemetery literally looking.
What did they do with them if you didn't pay?
I have no idea. I mean,
Because they do something similar to that in places in New York City. They'll leave them in for a while, and then they'll take them out and cremate them. They also dig them, they also have them stacked deep.
Yeah,
They'll do a multi-level.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure she knew. It was,
Oh, I got
like I
it.
say, my broken German and her broken English, we were
Sure.
able to piece that together. But I would imagine that they're either removed and cremated, or like you
Yeah.
say, I can't imagine stacking on top. You gotta go
Yeah.
pretty deep to go over the centuries.
Yeah.
Did you say there's still places that you can bury without a cement box?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Many cemeteries, it would be depending on what the cemetery rules are. You'd have to find that out. But there are cemeteries that you do not need a cement box. The Onondaga Indians, they don't ever use cement boxes. They use pine boxes, but because they want it to go back to earth. They want it to all go back to the ground. But Valley Cemetery, no concrete liner, but the cemetery plot could cost more money. The opening could cost more money. You don't know until you find out those other details. Just because they don't require a vault doesn't mean that that cemetery is going to be cheaper than, say, Tully Cemetery.
But it's not that a good idea, because where my
It's
mom
gonna
lives,
sink.
there's a woodchuck that goes
Yep.
down in there every day.
Yep.
You fill it with everything.
Sure.
And you can't, so if it was just wood,
Yep.
you wouldn't have that.
That's right, they could. They absolutely could. Yep. So it's definitely, it's a personal choice, you know. It's what you think, how you interpret with what happens in the, you know, if you believe in the afterlife, basically, is what it comes down to. It's your religion, it's your beliefs on the next life to come, or, you know, that's what it's your personal decisions. Yeah.
You still don't want a woodchuck there.
No, that's true. Yeah. But see, some people might not want woodchucks. Yeah. You had a question?
No, I was just going to say, a friend of mine that grew up in Italy, and his father worked in the cemetery, he said the custom there was in the late 1800s, early 1900s, is the poor people were buried in like a pit.
Oh, really?
And they just put the bodies in that pit.
Yeah. Wow.
and kept it covered, and then after so long, they cleaned the food.
Yeah. Well, another note, in this country, when they had the Black Plague and they had the fevers were going around and really doing mass amounts of people in, they would have, like, up at the county poorhouse, they had mass graves. And they would just, because they had to control the disease was just running rampant. And they had to get those people, and at the poorhouse there was no family. So they had to get them in the ground, they had to get them so that it wouldn't infect other people. So, you know, they did things like that here too. Yeah.
New
Yes.
Orleans cemeteries are very interesting.
Are they, when you read the
Well,
stones?
body. They just sense that the heat is so intense. And they don't use, I don't think they use coffins at all.
They're above ground. They were
They're
put in
so,
there and
they can't go down ground
Yeah.
because it's underwater.
Sure.
So they bring like a cement
It'd be a
mausoleum.
crypt.
And it's so hot, within a year it's all disintegrated.
So they put another body in.
Really?
And you read a whole great big long list of people that are buried in that spot.
They just keep going on top. Yeah, see? And that's another thing you'd have to think in your head, like up here we'd be like, oh my goodness, I can't imagine that thought. But down there, hey, it's normal. You know, so it's just another one of those things.
they had trouble identifying them.
Oh, really? Oh, boy. Yeah. Well, you'd know they were there. Yeah, yeah.
No.
Yeah. Have any? Go ahead.
Now, isn't it, you have the vault, my dad always said, the vaults even should go, because in high water, if no vaults, the bodies usually float up out.
If you were in a wooden casket, that really wouldn't happen.
Okay.
If you were in, say, a sealed metal casket that was just put in the ground, that's true. It possibly could happen if you had a high water table there. And that is why the cemetery monitors that decision if they require a vault or if they don't require a vault, because they would know best, you know, if there's a lot of springs in that cemetery or a lot of water in the area. Yeah.
What a great discussion we've had. We thank you so much for coming, and you might want to get some refreshments to keep your body in good shape. Right over here. And you could maybe ask Jason some more questions as we had to keep him here
Jason.
for a while.
Just for the, take a quick minute, explain your panels in the front
What
for
are these?
people.
Okay. Like I had mentioned, in the past, we had the horses, and this is a lambnoid bar, and it is symbolic of the hinge mechanism on an old coach. It's like the convertible roof on an old car or on an old carriage. And it just became symbolic of a hearse. And these actually belong to a Chevy Venture minivan, because that's where we've come. We've come from hearses that were horse-drawn to automobiles, and they always traditionally would be Cadillacs. And nowadays, we have these for Suburbans, we have these for Chrysler Town and Countries, these are for Uplander vans. This happens to be from a van we used to own. It was a Chevy Venture van. And they would slip right on your van on the back. If anybody has a Chevy Venture, you could turn it into a hearse as soon as you open the back windows. They slide right on. And we use these when we go to the house to pick up a decedent, or even to the hospital. And because nowadays hearses cost up near $100,000 for a hearse. So at our funeral home in Tully and Butler Badman Funeral Home on Onondaga Hill, we use close hearse service, and we rent a hearse when we need it. So